Hey there, and welcome to the Jeffrey Van Dyke Show, a podcast for paradigm changers. Each week I speak with another influential leader who's changing the conversation for their audience, their industry, and this world. I am so glad you're here. Welcome to the show. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Jeffrey Van Dyke Show. Today we have with us Dr. Mario Martinez, who's a licensed clinical psychologist and proponent of cultural psychoneuroimmunology. Here's why I invited Dr. Martinez onto the show. He is a true pioneer in helping us see how our culture, the fishbowl we live in, has an impact on our health and longevity. He's somebody that has studied a lot of disciplines and pulled them together to offer a more holistic view of our health, our immunology in a cultural context, which we talk a lot about in this episode. What I love about what he's up to is he's looking deeply at our culture and what he calls our cultural editors, those that had profound impact in how we see the world and how that impacts our immunity and health. The same things I look at when it comes to the path we ended up walking in our life and how that became the training program for our life's work and our life's purpose. So we're looking at a lot of the same things, but from a different lens. Dr. Martinez is a world expert in healthy longevity, the author of best-selling books, The Mind-Body Code and The Mind-Body Self. He invented this term biocognition to explain the nature of how the mind is encoded in the body. Biocognitive science integrates psychoneuroimmunology, neuroanthropology, and cultural neuroscience to offer a paradigm shift from reductionist biology to mind-body perception with a cultural brain. He specializes in how culture and transcendental beliefs affect health and longevity. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you do too. Welcome. Mario, thank you so much for being here. I got to tell you, every now and again, I run across someone whose vocabulary and philosophy and approach to their work feels so familiar to me. You know, where it's like, oh, yeah, like we're doing the same thing, but in a different way or in a different application, applied to maybe a different area of life. And preparing for this, I'm like, wow, we're like brothers, you know, we're doing similar work in different ways. So I'm really, really glad to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And it's I think you brought up something very interesting, and that is that thought leaders have specific ways of looking at the world and the service that they're going to do and everything. And there's a lot of compatibility in so many different disciplines. Like you're in the business, me in the health field. So I'm glad that you see it that way.
Awesome. So there's two areas I want to focus. First, I want to focus on your work, and we'll dedicate roughly the first half of the show to the work. And then I also want to talk with you about your journey into this work and being a pioneer in this field and your work as a change agent and paradigm changer. So I think that'll make more sense after we get into the work. So let's start there. At a high level, if you could start by just sharing, this is what my work's about, what would you say?
All right. Well, it's unquestionable now that the mind and the body communicate with each other. I mean, that's you have to be in a cave not to be able to see that. What I'm bringing into science is several things. One is that the mind and the body communicate in a cultural context. So I'm bringing culture into the communication. What is culture? I bring anthropology into my paradigm. My paradigm is basically psychoneuroimmunology, how thoughts and emotions affect the nervous, immune, and endocrine system. Anthropology, where we come from, the cultural neuroscience, how does the brain learn culture? So culture, the way to look at it is that there's a world out there with infinite possibilities of being interpreted. And what the culture does is it creates it weaves a fabric around that world, and what you see is a fabric. And what is a fabric? The most important things for survival and for meaning. So aesthetics, ethics, wellness, longevity, all of these other things, that's what a culture is. And what I have found is that psychoneuroimmunology is not just psychoneuroimmunology. My mentor, George Solomon, was the one who came up with the word psychoimmunology, then they call it psychoneuro. What I'm bringing in is cultural psychoneuroimmunology, so that then the immune system is not just responding to chemicals or to things out there, but is responding to your interpretation of the world. And then what I wanted to do was, okay, so if one thing that's very interesting to me is healthy longevity. I want to be around for a long time, but healthy. So as a neuropsychologist, I thought I'm going to study what works, which is centenarians, people that are over 100 and are healthy all over the world. But my reductionistic training, looking at the brain, and this is what the brain does, and gerontology that says as you grow older, you get decrepit, all of that, I thought, well, it's got to be genetics. So I start working on this. The last 20 years, I've interviewed over 100 centenarians. And I found that it's not genetics. Genetics is only 20 to 25%. So I identified four factors that we'll talk about that actually, independent of where they come from, is a universal cultural component that they have. And basically, it's how they interpret the world. Some eat meat, some don't. Some are wealthy, some are not. But those four components are really, really important. And especially, and this is a new, which I'm sharing with you, is that I work with a longevity center in Poland. It's one of the top longevity centers in the world. And they do biological markers and they do epigenetic markers, which I'll explain. So I've developed a questionnaire that identifies how close you come to those four components of what centenarians do. And then we correlate them with biological markers and epigenetic markers that are both genetic and epigenetic. And then we can, by doing that, we can reverse biological age. And it doesn't have to be with medications, some supplements, but not that. It's the way that you perceive the world, what in neuroscience, what's called a default mode. And this is why sometimes you could do meditation and yoga and all those things, and then within a few minutes you're back into an alarm.
Yeah.
Because a default mode is what needs to be changed, not the external things that you do. So it's basically the general idea.
Got it. So let's start here. Thank you. You talk about biosymbology, right? Things being biosymbolic, especially in the context of culture. So, work I do, I look up deeply at people's life history as the preparation for their life's work in the world, particularly how our core wounds put us on a particular path of training and development that ends up being a requirement for what we're here to contribute. So talk to us a little bit about early childhood in the context of culture and what biosymbology is in the context of culture.
Okay. People talk about, for example, thoughts affect your immune system, words affect your immune system, but nobody tells you why or how.
Right.
So you have to go back to the anthropology. So just very quickly, so you can see what I mean. We are basically Homo sapiens are been around for 150,000 years, but language came about only about 50,000 years ago, and consciousness about 130,000. So we had consciousness, and we know we had consciousness because of the tools, and tools are 3 million years, but basically we started burying our dead about 130,000 years ago.
Which is
Not only
symbolic.
burying our dead, but burying them with special things and trinkets that they had. So that's the beginning of consciousness. You have to have cognition to be able to do that. What the so-called caveman didn't know past, present, future was a constant present. So you develop a consciousness. Then language comes around 50,000 years ago. So before, you had to go with your senses. You smell a lion 300 meters away, and you have a stress hormone response. Okay, so you did that for many hundreds of thousands of years. Now you learn language, and language says there's a lion there, 300 meters away, and the words become biosymbolic because they replace the senses. And then the brain has to learn the symbols, and the immune system has to learn to interpret the cultural brain. So this is why then, if I say to somebody, "You're so stupid," and I shame them, you have molecules of inflammation, as if there's some kind of a pathogen there. But if I say, "You're so wonderful, you're so great," dopamine, endorphins, oxytocin, all these things. So It's a biosymbolic system. So words are no longer inert. They never were. But now words have meaning and they have a psychoneuroimmunological consequence. So that's the idea of why I call it
Yeah.
biosymbolic.
Love that word combo, biosymbolic, because how I think how we interpret our world is via symbol. Uh, but I've never considered it directly related to our biology and our our biochemistry. Let's get into this. You talk about the archetypal wounds, right? Three archetypal wounds, and how they relate to our biochemistry. So let's dive into that if you would.
All right. And the reason you hadn't heard about it is because it hadn't been done. The biology has been kept from a distance to the what I call the biosymbols. But the archetypal wounds, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's really a basic component in my work, is that just as I looked for centenarians and found what was needed to have a long life, I looked for ways that the culture would wound you emotionally. And I found that fortunately there are only three ways, but that's plenty. You can be abandoned, you can be shamed, or you can be betrayed. And interestingly, each of them has a temperature, has a biosymbolic response immunologically, and has implications with relationships, longevity. But I also found that each of them has an antidote.
Mm-hmm.
And what I do is I teach the antidote. But these things can't be done intellectually. It has to be done in a contemplative, experiential way. Otherwise, I would say, "Hey, Jeffrey, don't be depressed. What a pretty day. Okay, I'm not going to be
Right.
depressed anymore." It
Snap.
doesn't work
Done.
that way. It symbolically, and it's an embodiment. But that's where the archetypal wounds come on. And every culture has them. They give it a different flavor, but every culture, and the reason is that the tribes want to keep you within the
Mm-hmm.
collective good. They want to keep you there. But then when you want to individuate, you no longer can serve the collectivism. And the way to keep you there or the way to control you is with one of the
Right.
archetypal wounds.
So you
So
you talk about each one having a immune response. Share with us, if you could, the immune response of shame, abandonment, and betrayal.
okay. Now that we know that the brain is biosymbolic and the immune system is biosymbolic, now I can talk about it. All right. The most primitive is abandonment. If you abandon a child, they die. The next one is shame, but you can only shame a child when they can identify themselves in a
Mm-hmm.
mirror. People will say, I can shame a 1 year old. No, you're scaring them. Shaming requires some cognition and embarrassment. And the most complex is betrayal because that's a tricking. So going to abandonment basically feels cold. And the way it feels cold is because your vascular system is constricting and you feel cold. And that constriction causes immunological deficiency because it shuts down the immune system. And there's a correlation, not a cause, but a correlation between the underimmunity and propensities for cancer and problems with infections and underimmunity. That's the
Let me
abandonment.
ask this. Oh,
The
hold on.
shame,
Let's
which
stay
is
on abandonment for just a minute.
yeah,
So when I look, part of what I look at with my clients around their wounding is what happened, how did they feel, what did they crave, what did they do, what skills did they develop, and what beliefs did they adopt. Those are the primary places I'm looking. And with all of them, there is an adaptive response, right? I couldn't get my need met head on, so I needed to adapt to at least get a facsimile of my need met, right? So if I couldn't get love directly, but I could get praise when I achieved, well, now I'll become a higher achiever, for example. What's the adaptive response around the vascular system constricting and you getting cold? How does that help with abandonment, like from a physical survival standpoint? Would be the purpose of it originally.
the reason. is that the reason, and I'm glad you bring this up and that you work with your clients with that, because I'll give you some other information on that. The reason that that you get cold is that the vascular system goes deep to protect you from wounds. It's fight or flight. So it's getting a protection from if you get cut, then you don't bleed to death
Uh-huh.
as much unless you get a main artery. That's the first thing. But what happens though, and this is the part that's so important in relationships and so forth, is that you learn those wounds from the culture editors, people that have a lot of meaning in your life. And in many cases, those wounds are entangled with the concept of
Hmm.
love. So at some point you adapt, but at another point there's a dysfunction. And this is why you say people that say, I've been in five relationships and they all abandon me because there's an entanglement that says biosymbolically, love means
Hmm.
abandonment. And I had a patient who had been abused by her husband many times, and she had been abused by her father. So there was a betrayal and abandonment and all that. So one day she comes in and she says, "I think my husband is having an affair." I said, "Why?" She said, "He hasn't beat me up in a
Hmm.
month." You see how sad that is, but that's the conception that we have. And although we say no, no, intellectually, no, I'm not going to do this, the fabric is there, and that needs to be changed. You need to untangle the love with the wounds in order for you to be able to love and so forth. Because another thing that happens is that, of course, self-esteem is affected in all three. So you get to certain levels, let's say in the adaptive, but you get to a point where it's too much and you begin to sabotage it and bring you back into misery, which is more, it's less anxiety producing than unknown joy. So they have to be entangled, they have to be cleaned up because the adaptive is good, but it also requires untangling it from the meaning
Yeah.
of
I
life.
mean, essentially to me, when I look at adaptive responses, they're necessary at the time. And then they
Yeah.
they serve a purpose when they serve a purpose. And then later in life, you know, we don't seem to auto update and just go, oh, don't need that adaptive response anymore and stop doing it. The patterning is there. So we keep working out the patterning until we detangle the patterning. So abandonment is cold. What's shame?
Shame is hot. And shame, you notice that when people are ashamed, they
Flush.
turn red and they're hot. Okay, they flush. And what's happening is that their body is secreting molecules of inflammation as if there's some pathogen out there. So it's hot, and the main emotion that you feel is embarrassment. In abandonment, the main emotion is fear, isolation. And shame is you want the earth to
Mm.
swallow you. You want to become small. And then what's happening is the inflammation is what's causing the hotness. You notice that when there's inflammation, you
Yeah.
touch it and it's hot. That's because of the inflammatory molecules like interleukins and so forth. So that's the second one, and the third, which is the most complex, is also hot. But look how interesting. It's hot rather than with fear, with anger. When you're betrayed, you're angry, and you can do it with a child. You can a 5-year old. You can tell them, "Look, I have this iPhone here. I'll let you play with it if you do a little song for me." And then they do the song and say, "No, you're not. You're not going to get it. You betrayed." They don't get embarrassed or abandoned.
Yeah.
They get angry. But look how interesting the psychoneuroimmunology of it is. In both cases, you have constriction. In the abandonment, you have constriction cold. In the betrayal, you have constriction hot. Same hormones expressing one with anger and one with fear, and you have constriction on
So,
both.
what are common illnesses associated with abandonment cold, shame hot with embarrassment, and betrayal hot with anger?
With anger, yes. Well, I have to overemphasize that these are
Uh
correlations,
huh.
not
Right.
causes, but there's clinical correlation. If you can divide everything into hypoimmunity, hyperimmunity, or autoimmunity, you would see that hypo is underimmunity, hyper is overimmunity, and auto is immunity against self. The hypoimmunity would be illnesses like cancer, some kinds of infections. That would be hyperimmunity, allergies. You're responding. Autoimmunities is like anything with inflammation, like fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, MS, those things. So then, if you go back and you look at the abandonment, there's a strong correlation between abandonment and skin problems or some kinds of infections or cancer,
Mm-hmm.
viruses, because you have an underimmunity, specifically in that sense. With shame, it's very interesting. Shame, because of the inflammatory kind of concept or expression, there's a tendency or a correlation with autoimmune illnesses. I have worked with many women who had fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, and 90% of them have some kind of shaming wound. It's there. Because now the thinking is that chronic inflammation can confuse the immune system to a point where it becomes to do autoimmune kinds of damage. And the third, with betrayal, there's a correlation between cardiovascular and strokes and things like that, a
Mm-hmm.
correlation. So it's very interesting that it's not causing it, but there's some strong clinical correlation with these things happening, which is saying if you're chronically secreting molecules of inflammation, well, the propensity for an autoimmune illness related to a potential of family, it can be
Yeah.
expressed. So that begins to give you an idea that how we learn to get
Yeah.
sick.
Just out of curiosity, so I had a few people in mind as I was listening to you preparing for this conversation. So one has ankylosing spondylitis, another fibromyalgia. So those would be correlated to shame. Yes.
Yes.
What about obesity or diabetes? And I'm curious about type 1 and type 2.
Well, it really depends because the type one and type two are considered autoimmune to a certain degree. They you don't have the cells to produce the insulin and so forth, and so that would be related to more to
Mm-hmm.
to the shaming, if you can
Mm-hmm.
correlate them that way. And then obesity is very interesting because obesity could be more related to issues with limit setting, and it could be from any of the three, actually. Very interesting. Because obesity, and there are hormonal issues and so forth, but most of I call it food monal. It's an abuse of food. And it's an abuse of food because somehow it has nothing to do with food. What you're doing is you're either protecting yourself or punishing yourself or doing something that comes from one of the wounds that said to you, if I gain weight, I can be protected from this. Or if I gain weight, I can pay for my sins. And unless you deal with the issues, and as you know now in biocognition, I don't deal with behavior.
Yeah.
Behavior is a waste. I deal with the terrain that supports the behavior. So if you're trying to lose weight, I don't care what you eat, what you don't eat. I'm looking at the terrain that allows for the excessive dysfunctional behavior. And that's what we work on. Addiction's the same thing. Forget the how many lines of cocaine you do. What is the terrain? Because if you clean one up, it comes out some other way because you didn't
Yeah.
clean up the terrain.
Yeah. Uh, I want to go two places next. One, you talked about boundaries, especially around these different pieces. So I'm curious about boundaries and wounds and healing wounds. And then I want to hear a little bit about okay, so what are some of the interventions? How do we do this work? So let's go to boundaries first.
All right. Boundaries are learned. You have to go to developmental psychology and so forth to look at the boundary. You notice that children around 3, they start saying no, no, no. And they learn the word no, and it has power because they say no and you stop. But what happens if you abuse that boundary? What happens if they say no and you beat them up or you abuse them sexually? What happens? There's no boundary setting. There's no sexual or psycho emotional process going on, no biocognitive process that says, okay, no means something. So then they learn not to set good limits. And they learn, and getting back to your point, that most things have an initial function. You had to not have boundaries when you have a very powerful parent. But then later you're an adult and you still don't have boundaries. And that has to be learned because you didn't learn it when you needed to learn it. So that's the boundary component. You don't learn boundaries either because they were abused or because they never set limits. They said, do
Mm-hmm.
whatever you want. Just do it. And now, unfortunately, there's a lot of education that says, well, if you feel happy getting a C, don't worry about getting a B or an A. And what it's doing is saying to people, hey, look, I'm not going to prepare you for the world. Because you go to a corporation and they say, look, I want to produce whatever makes me happy.
Yeah.
You'll be fired. So it's very naive because they're bringing in political correctness rather than science into the equation. So getting back to what you were saying, the good news in biocognition is that I don't do anything that doesn't have a way to fix it. Otherwise, I don't want to deal with it. So what I have found clinically and in my research is that each of the wounds, if you have a wound, if you have a dysfunction, there has to be some kind of antidote for the dysfunction. I mean, that's the yin yang of things. That's how it is. So what I found is that each of the wounds has what I call an antidote, a consciousness antidote that reverses the damage. So when I talk about abandonment, commitment is the antidote to abandonment. And I'll explain them in a minute. For shame, honor is the antidote for shame. And for betrayal, loyalty is the antidote, but not to anybody. It's commitment to self, loyalty to self, honor to self. And the reason is that if you see yourself as a bioinformational field, when someone wounds you, they disempower you. It doesn't have anything to do with the person did, it's your interpretation of what the person did. So you have to come up with a new way to deal with it. And with abandonment, commitment to self. And I'll explain a little later as we go along. But basically, what you're doing is you're changing the bioinformational field. What is a practical application? All right. Let's say you have a shaming wound. And in your corporate world, you go to a corporate meeting, and the CEO, you're a little late, and the CEO says in front of everybody, oh, there you are. I can always count on you on being late.
Late again.
All right. And you notice that you have an overreaction. An overreaction is an indication that you're bringing the history of your wound into the moment. So at that moment, you stop. You know that your wound is shame, so you stop. You take a deep breath, and you ask yourself, what is the honorable thing that I need to do right now for me? And it could be, yes, I'm late, and I'll talk to you later about this. And then later, the honorable thing, you talk to the guy and say, look, that's okay if you talk to me privately, but I'm a professional like you. So in order for you to get the antidotes to work, there always has to be some limit setting because you have to change the reaction.
This is where the boundaries comes in. There has to be limit
Yes,
setting
yes,
for any of the antidotes.
that's right.
Got
That's
it.
right. Because they keep wounding you then. And you have to be brave enough to say, hey, look, if this is how it's going to be, I'm going to look for another job. Why? Because if you don't, the job will kill you or make you sick.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because for all of us, I think around what we want in life, there's risk taking, you know, whether
Yes.
it's something we want externally or whether it's how we want our world to be or how we want our biology to be or our biochemistry to be. So there's a boundary for each one of these. So with shame, it's honor. With abandonment, it is commitment. And
Commitment,
betrayal, it's loyalty. Uh-huh.
loyalty. So another example, because I think with examples and stories is the best way to get
Yep.
complex information and also for it to apply. So let's say there's an abandonment. And these could be little things that trigger it. Abandonment, you're getting together with a friend for lunch, and you say 12 o'clock, it's 12:15, it's 12:20, and you're beginning
Yeah.
to blow up. Well, you're bringing the abandonment one. What you do again, you take a deep breath to be aware, to bring it into awareness. Okay, I'm doing an abandonment run here. What is a commitment that I need to make to myself now and set boundaries? The commitment would be I'm going to start eating, and when that person comes in, that's it. When that person comes in, I'll tell them, look, I wanted to eat, so whatever. Or look, next time you're late, call me, or some kind of boundary to stop the abuse.
I love that.
And
One of the things I always say with basically everybody in my life, including my clients, one of my top values is people that can stay in the conversation. So if something's not working,
Yeah.
if you're mad at me, if I did something that didn't work for you, tell me first. Don't go talking to other people. Don't check out and disappear. Come to me, right? Because if we can't
Yes.
do that, we can't have a relationship. There's no trust, there's no foundation of a relationship there. And that piece of, okay, you're not going to run away. You're not going to peace out and ditch the relationship because something stopped working. Let me ask this. So I can, in my mind's eye, see both what I might call macro and micro shaming experiences early in life and later in life. I can see both gross and subtle ways that betrayal happens. Talk to me about the gross and subtleties around abandonment, because there's gross abandonment. I think is easy for us to imagine, right? Being given up for adoption, something like that. But what are the more subtle forms of abandonment, especially early in life?
Some of the all the three wounds, but some of the abandonment wounds have to do with what we call in psychology vicarious, by watching it, by either watching it being done to somebody else in your family, or abandonment could be your father is very successful, provides for everything, but he's never there. He's emotionally not available. Implicitly, you're learning abandonment. You're learning that to succeed, you have to be away from the family. So you learn that lesson. And if you ask, have you ever been abandoned? No, I've never been abandoned. And then you go deeper. Oh yeah, my father was he was a professor, and he would travel all the time. When did you spend time with him? Well, not very much. He gave me everything I needed. He was a great father. But you see, that is an abandonment wound. That's an implicit
I
abandonment
so
wound
appreciate
that you're
that.
picking up.
One of the wounds I've really looked at when I was a kid, my mom would fly off the handle in fits of rage, and then kind of collapse and usually nap for a couple hours and come back and say, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. This isn't me. My father didn't know how to deal with that. He was raised in a very emotionally cold household. So his solution was he bought a plot of land and started building us another house. Uh, and so from the time I was 3 till like 5.5, nights and weekends, after he'd go wake up at 5 in the morning, go off to work, be done by 3:30, go to the job site, this land, and literally basically by himself. His father was a builder, so he grew up building houses. Built this house, this 3,500 square foot home. Um,
Yeah.
but he was just not there. And then after that, he started traveling a ton for work and also wasn't there a bunch. But, one of the pieces I discovered when I was doing deep work, the mom stuff was obvious, but the abandonment piece, I never saw it, at first, because
Yeah.
it was like the young part of me going, why isn't he here? Why isn't he doing his duty to protect me? And that to me was both the abandonment and the betrayal, kind of connected
Yes.
to one another. And it,
And intellectually, you say, I'll never do that, but it's in your
yeah,
fabric already. So you play it out. You look for cues. For example, people will say, "Well, why is it that?" Or ask, "Why is it that children of alcoholics have a very high probability of finding alcoholics?" Well, they don't go and say, "Are you an alcoholic?" or "Are you over drinking?" But they look at the terrain of the alcoholic. What is the terrain of the alcoholic? Someone who is not very insightful in what's going on with them. Someone who doesn't have good limit setting, someone who delays reinforcement. Those are the things. And you begin to see them early in the relationship, but you say, well, he's not drinking, she's not drinking, that's okay. But the terrain is there. Then eventually you could be a dry drunk and you're getting abused the same way as if you're drinking. That's how we pick it up because we have a selective perception. It's not the law of attraction or anything like that. It's a selective perception that we have. If you want to buy a Rolex watch, you see it
right.
all over the world. If you don't want to buy it,
Yeah.
you don't see it. So we tend to attract, or not attract, we tend to select what we have a preconception
I like
of
to
what we
think
want.
about.
And without knowing it,
Yeah, go ahead.
without knowing what we do is we look for the terrain.
Yeah.
We look for the terrain. If let's say abandonment, you start a new relationship, and your partner or your potential partner is great. They're not abandoning anything, but every once in a while they're late, and they don't apologize for being late. It's not an issue for them. Oh, I was late. Yeah, well, I'm sorry. And you look for a pattern. You begin to see, wait a minute, there's some indications here that now another one of abandonment. Abandonment is they have a real difficult time accepting gratitude. They have a real problem with gratitude. So then, if you don't have gratitude, you never look at the totality of the relationship when there are problems. You always look at what have you done for me lately so I can abandon you. If you have a relationship that's been good and then you have some adversity, okay, let me look at the totality of the relationship and see if it's worth it. But if you don't have, if the meter's not recording with the gratitude, then, well, so what? You've been here for 20 years, but now you did this to me, so I'm out of here. Abandonment. So it's very subtle. The terrain concept
Yeah.
is very
No, I
subtle.
really appreciate this concept of terrain because, we're all ecosystems, inside of
Yes.
ecosystems. Uh, Even when I look at like people that are experts around habits and, creating better habits and whatnot, the real experts never talk about behavior. They all talk about terrain, right? The terrain
Yes.
of your psychology, the terrain of how is your environment set up for the thing you say you want to do. So talk to me a little bit about the like how do you work with people around introducing the behavioral excuse me, not the behavioral, but the the antidotes to shame, abandonment, betrayal.
Well, the first thing is not to blame. And the first thing is to let people know that they were very brilliant in adjusting to a dysfunctional situation because that's the only way they could survive. So knowing that, what we look for is not how you messed up, but what are you using that is no longer serving you well? It's not functional anymore. And in fact, we have what I call a survival override that if you're doing something for survival, it's not going to kill you. But when it's no longer survival, it has a critical
I
mass and you get
love
sick.
that. That's so true.
So knowing that, yeah, knowing that, then you know, okay, now it had a function, but daddy's not there anymore and you're still not setting limits. Why? Because we have to go back and create the consciousness that you could have had when you were little, the consciousness of honor or commitment or loyalty. We can learn that. But the neuromaps that you learn, we do a technique that I call the theater of change, where I have people go into a contemplative state and I teach them how to rerun it and all that. But then the brain doesn't create neuromaps that way. It creates very, very weak neuromaps. You can talk to somebody, for example, with a functional MRI, where you can see that what the brain is doing in real time, and you can create ideas, and you see the neuromaps coming together, but they're very weak. The way that you support them, let's say we work on a particular issue of abandonment with you, then you bring moments when you were committed, and you embody that from your archives. And not only that, for the next few weeks, for the brain to create a neural maps, you act in a committed consciousness. And then the neural maps get stronger and the others get weaker and weaker. And then you have rather than abandonment consciousness, you have commitment consciousness. And that's what I do with fibromyalgia. And we're beginning to test now in Poland. Clinically, I can tell you that honor is anti-inflammatory, clinical. But we're going to be testing it now, looking at interleukins and other things to actually look at how you can actually reduce inflammation by honor
So
consciousness.
appreciate that. All right. One more piece, and then I kind of want to move into your journey. How, if somebody's listening to this going, okay, these three archetypal wounds of abandonment, shame, betrayal, how do I know which one I'm running? To know what to
Okay,
know
there's a technique.
which antidote to introduce.
In my first book, The Mind Body Code, I talk about that and I give
All
specific
right.
methods of doing it. And talking about that, we know that there's a genetic code the genomes, and but when consciousness evolved, some evolutionary biologists and others and myself believe that there's also a mind code. The mind code is not the same as the gene code. The mind code is more like the epigenetic code. So you have to know that. You have to practice it and learn it. And in the book, I explain each of the methods. But basically, the idea is that you have a technique that I use where you go into the wound, you embody it, you clean it, you go into the antidote, you embody it, you enhance it, and then you begin to practice it. Because movement is another way of creating
All right, got
neuromaps.
it. And I think you would also say, or imagine you would say, you can also, as a starting place, look at the terrain that you were raised in terms of who were my cultural
Yes,
editors, how did they do my cultural
yes,
editing, what tools did they employ, how did I perceive what was happening and interpret it, and how did I then start to build kind of my own ecosystem around shame, abandonment, or betrayal. Yeah.
very much. And also, most important is the co-authors that you created in your theater to maintain the
Uh-huh.
dysfunction. You have to look at the co-authors. Because if, let's say, you're no longer accepting co-authors that abandon you, well, you're going to have to set limits with those people. Otherwise, they continue to be the demons that
Yeah.
run inside. So you have to go to the co-authors and begin to see: is this a co-author that I can keep in my journey, or is this a co-author that I need to get rid of?
You know what's so funny? So I do this thing with clients around. Well, I do it primarily around their clients, but I've also done it with them in the whole area of their life. I just do a what I call a four square, four squares, four boxes, one, two, three, four. Ones are people that enhance your life. Twos are people that are relatively neutral. Threes are people that drain you, and fours are people that are destructive. So, for example, in business, a four is somebody that might slander your name publicly, right? That's a four, that's destructive. Threes are the people that complain and need all sorts of extra help and support, and they just drain you and your team. Twos, they're good, right? They don't necessarily elicit your genius and your best work, but they're good. And ones
Yeah.
are people that elicit your greatest skills, that are like, oh my God, I just love being around them. I love working with them. And, you know, I primarily do it with them around their clients, because one of the things I find is that as we grow in our own journeys as leaders, we have to keep editing out, changing who the co-authors are around our lives. And those aren't just our family and friends, it's also our clients when we're working with folks in business, right? And that can be so like, okay, wow, I've got to stop working with some of these people. They're not supporting the life I say I want to live and the work I'm here to do. Yeah, go ahead.
And in your world, I see what you're saying about our parallel way of thinking. In your world, which is very compatible, that in the quadrant of the neutrals and the positives, those are the people that you create what I call the subcultures of wellness to
Mm-hmm.
support your new behaviors. Because if you don't have that, you lose all the therapeutic gains. Even in anti-aging, Ellen Langer at Harvard, a colleague, has done some things on her own and some of my own, of actually being able to reverse age within a week. But initially, when she was doing it initially, when I was doing it, we didn't do the cultural support, and within 6 weeks, it would lose all the
Mm-hmm.
therapeutic gains. So it's very important when you're changing something, you're still very vulnerable. But you have to have somebody that if you say, I just did something that was brilliant. Oh, really? Tell me about it. As opposed to, oh,
Yeah.
don't be conceited.
Yeah.
And that's extremely important in maintaining therapeutic
I
gains.
so appreciate you sharing that. So, how did you get into this? Let's talk about your journey. Um, where did this start? Did you start in, by going to medical school? Like, yeah, how did you get here?
All right. Well, in culture, I'm Spanish French. My grandfather was an engineer, and my mother wanted me to be an engineer. So I said, okay. And when I was a kid, what are you going to be? I'm
Yeah.
going to be an engineer. But then I started engineering, and it was terrible. I hated it. It wasn't my brain. So I went back to my mother and I said, look, I'm not going to be an engineer. And she said, well, do anything except psychology or
Ah,
medicine.
ah, ah, ah.
I said, okay. So then I started medical school in Spain, Madrid. First year, second year, then the riots. They start the riots. So they closed the medical school was the most radical. So I couldn't go to school for a few months, so I go to psychology. Again, psychology. So finally I said, hell with it. I'm going to psychology. I'm going to drop medicine. So I went into neuropsychology and became a clinical neuropsychologist. But then I thought about, well, yeah, neuropsychology is fine and everything. But after a while, I got tired of looking at, I was excited. Oh, because if you have this kind of in the Broca part of the brain, you're going to have this type of aphasia. It's interesting. But after a while, you're dealing with people that don't want to change, strokes and problems. And it gets depressing. So I thought, no, I want to look at the causes of health. What are the causes of health? Not the causes of aging and the causes of getting old. But because of my training, I thought it's got to be genetics. And that's when it turned around. But the other thing is I found the power of culture. I grew up in New York and Miami. In New York, I was living as a child in an Irish German neighborhood. There weren't a lot of Spanish at the time. So one day I go to my mother because I begin to see the cultural admonitions and things. And I said to my mother, I think I want to dye my hair blonde. And she looks at me and she says, do it if you want to. If you want to look like a clown, go ahead. That took care of it. But you see, I thought, wait a minute, this is culture. And in my culture, I don't have to be blonde. In this culture, I have to be blonde. So I started then getting excited and very interested in what culture is all about. And some cultures you're great, and other cultures you're not. So those were the foundational kinds of things that got me into what I am. Then I was fortunate enough to meet George Solomon, and George was my mentor in psychoneuroimmunology. And I thought, not only is this exciting, but thoughts and emotions can affect your immune system and your nervous system and so forth. So it came from that. And then I developed an expertise in cultural psychoneuroimmunology and epigenetics
Yeah.
and things like that.
I find that around people being change agents, there's often people that just say, I'm not going to deal with the existing culture or system. I'm not going to deal with the medical establishment. I'm just going to go over here and do my thing and usher in a new consciousness, and those that want to hear it come along. And then there are those that are more like, no, I am here to help change the system that I come from. Do you find that you sit more in one camp or another?
Yes, I'm in the integrative. If you go to alternative medicine, you can't go to a shaman to tell you that be one with the universe when you
Mm-hmm.
have a fracture or
Mm-hmm.
you have a heart attack. You have to go to a medical doctor. But medicine has some limitations. Medicine is great with acute issues, but not so great
Yeah.
with systems issues. They don't cure anything that's systemic or very few. So you have to integrate the best of reductionist medicine, the best of functional medicine, the best of shamans and anything. You bring it together. And that's what my field is. My field, the way that I think it works so well is because you have psychoneuroimmunology, cultural anthropology, psychology, and all of that, it's we're too complex to have one system
Yeah.
explain everything. It,
Yeah.
it just doesn't work. So you have to bring. You notice I brought anthropology, cultural psychoneuroimmunology, depending on what you need. So I'm more of an integrative person rather than an isolationist,
Yeah.
either or.
Have you, like, when it comes to the medical community, from the folks that I know in the world of medicine that come from the world of medicine, oftentimes the world of medicine doesn't want to hear stuff like this. What's been your experience around that, and how have you navigated it?
There's some that are never going to hear what you have to say, no matter what, because they're so reductionistic and they think they know everything. That's what I call arrogant pseudoscience. That's not science. A real scientist will say, "Show me." A technician will say, I can only believe in what I can measure or the extension of my senses can measure. That's it. That's a real scientist says, well, show me. And then the other thing about it is that I speak their language. For example, I went to a conference, I was presenting a paper, and this physician, a cardiologist, he says, that's a bunch of mumbo jumbo. That's just psychologists don't know anything. What do you know about the heart and on and on? And I said, okay, look, let's take a look at it. You're being skeptical and you're being a bit toxic right now. Your IgAs, which are some of the antibodies, are going down right now. And he said, no shit, really? So not only that, but if you want to look at the heart and you broken heart of that, now there's a syndrome called the broken heart syndrome. Takotsubo, they call it, which means that if you have a broken heart, there 60% of the people will actually, their left ventricle will look like what the Japanese call a trap for squids and for other kinds of animals. And it's called takotsubo. And that's how the ventricle looks. And then it resolves itself without any damage within a few weeks. Broken heart syndrome. It's not your toe, it's your heart. So
Yeah.
it's biosymbolic. So if you speak the language, the ones who are intelligent and flexible
Yeah.
will hear you. The ones who are not, no matter what you give them, it'll be like the Copernicus effect. No, look, there's a telescope here in Galileo. It's a telescope that the Earth is not. No, no, no. The Earth is the
Yeah.
center of the universe. You can't deal with
Yeah.
people like that.
I'm curious if you've looked at this at collective levels at all. Like, you know, do you see that certain illnesses? Okay, let me back up and say this. We've all heard things like, oh, the Mediterranean diet because they live this way. Or, oh, people in India have a lot of turmeric and they don't have the same inflammation that we have and whatnot. Hearing you, okay, that may be a piece of it. What about the cultural piece, right? So I'm curious if you've looked, even if it's anecdotally, just because of your own curiosity, around cultural patterns in different communities or countries and the collective health impacts you see in different locations.
Yes, that's a brilliant question, and I'll tell you, those things are necessary, but not sufficient. They're not sufficient. And with another story, I can tell you how this came about. I went to Cuba to look at some centenarians. So I started asking anthropologically. I do ethnographic. I don't do psychological testing or anything like that. And so I asked this woman who was 102, instead of saying, what are your rituals, which are very important, I asked her in an anthropological way to not bias it, what do you do on a regular basis that has meaning for you, that has some kind of identity that you look forward to? She said, immediately said, oh, I have a shot of rum before I go to sleep. And I thought, Cuban rum. It's got to be the quality. See, reductionistic. Next day, I go to another centenarian. I said, what do you do? The same thing. He said, the moment I wake up, I have a cigar. Cuban cigar and rum, that does it. It's the ritual. The ritual is what has that immunological enhancement. And they never abuse the rituals. When I ask them, how many shots do you have of rum? One. Why? That's all I enjoy. The cigar? One or two. That's all I enjoy. So they don't abuse it. So the ritual is one of the causes of
How is
health.
that so? How do rituals support our health?
Well, because you're born in the fabric, right? And an example, the uh, the horsemen of the Caucasus and the Georgian part of what used to be the Soviet Union, they eat a lot of dairy, and many of them have obstructive arteries without any symptoms. I'm not suggesting you do that, but there's some people that eat a lot of meat, and so they override. Some of them are hypertensive, and it overrides because what you're learning is that it's good to eat dairy. So therefore, the French paradox: the French eat more fat, they drink more wine, and they have longer longevity. The Italians the same way because they have the it's contextual. It's very important contextual. The context will determine how much insulin you're going to need, how much pain medication you're going to need. Quite a bit of research in that area. So if you are born in that concept, and the ritual means this is who I am in this world, and this feels good. For example, if you're a vegan out of fear, it's not going to help you as much as if you're a McDonald's out of joy. So the joy And the embodiment and the cultural components is what helps you sometimes even override things. Now, you don't want to abuse it because nobody should abuse it. But what I found is that it's not what I thought. It's a point that you brought up there, so brilliant, that it's not just the turmeric or this or that. It's the ritual that you have with the food that you have with people, the things that you do with people. In Spain and Italy and in other countries, children, not children, but maybe adolescents, will drink wine with a family because it's a food. So you're not waiting to be 21 so you can abuse it and get drunk. So all those things are very important in the culture. So it's more important your perception of what you're doing. For example, centenarians believe that everybody loves them. Everybody loves them. Believing that you're being loved is more important than being loved
I love that.
immunologically.
Believing that you are loved is more important than being loved. Yeah.
And that's the second cause of health. What George Solomon called healthy narcissism. And healthy narcissism is what I propose. Another example: the Cuban who smoked the cigar, they gave him a party after we talked. Because everywhere they are, they're treated like superstars. So there are a lot of women there, and he comes up to me and he says, "Have you noticed how the women are looking at me? They're all in love with me."
Uh-huh.
That's narcissism. But then inclusive narcissism, he said, have you noticed how beautiful they all are? He includes them in the narcissism. That's healthy narcissism. Now, superstars that don't believe that they're loved and that millions of people love them, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're not getting the oxytocin and the things that you get if you believe that you're being loved.
I so appreciate, after all the years of working with the folks I've worked with, if there's one thing that I see as the difference between a lot of the folks I work with and some of the folks I work with is, did they believe they were loved as a kid? Because the ones that didn't believe they were loved, oh, they just don't have the same level of resilience that others do. They seem to get hung up
Yes.
on stuff, and as much as they work at it, like, it just keeps hanging them up, and they seem to stay stuck more readily. It's harder for them to get out of ruts, to accomplish the things they say they want to accomplish. And even when I've worked with people who've had massively abusive homes, really destructive childhoods, if there was at least one person in their life, an uncle, a grandpa, somebody, where they go, well, that person loved me. I was loved by somebody. Radically different.
Yes. You're absolutely right. You don't need a lot of people. I'll give you an example of an extreme. I was working with this patient. I call them wellness students now, but they were patients when I was in private practice. She has been sexually abused for years. And we were doing the technique of getting to somebody who loved you, somebody who gave you validation, someone who gave you a sense of worthiness. Couldn't find anybody. Her problem was that she lived with her father, the mother abandoned, and while children are going home thinking about what kind of snack they're going to have, she was feeling about her father who was disabled, how she could avoid the father. Look at what kind of hell you go into. So we kept working and working until finally, and you do this under the contemplative that theater of change. And she said, "Okay, okay, I remember now. I was walking home, and it was snowing, and this little lady 2 homes from me that I never knew, she called me in. I went there. She gave me chocolate and cake. I felt so good. Within a week, I left the house. I went away. I ran away at 15. No more abuse." Look at the power. So what happens is that since you're not loved, your meter of love doesn't pick up on the things that actually you were loved. The
Mm-hmm.
meter's not there. So it doesn't record. But if you get them back to the recording, then they go in this, okay, now embody how you felt when that woman did that to you. And this is how you're going to function when you set
I
limits with
love
people.
that. I
An
love that.
embodiment.
All right. If you have a vision for the future, your hope for how your work helps change this world, like, what's the vision you have? What's the hope you have?
The most important thing is to be aware of the power that the culture has, that you're in a fishbowl without knowing it, and you function with a fishbowl, and the medical profession and the theologicals and all, they're all within the fishbowl. So, for example, in Germany, there's a higher probability of an EKG that they do to be seen as pathological. In France, they overuse the medications for liver. In the United States, an overuse of depression. In Germany, it has to do with what they call heart insufficiency. So each of them has a way of looking at the world. And my function is to get people to get out and become outliers, to individuate. And then you pay the price. But if you have the tools, the price is well worth it.
Awesome. Thank you. How can people learn more about you and your work?
The easiest way would be biocognitive.com. I had to make up the word, biocognitive.com, my website. Also, I have over 200 free videos, of course, on YouTube, Dr. Mario Martinez. And of course, I have 2 bestsellers, The Mind Body Code, The Mind Body Self. You can get on Amazon or anywhere. But also, I'm going to be doing a course with Shift Network, a 7-week course explaining and teaching how to change consciousness to reverse your age. And one last thing I want to tell you, which is very hopeful, with the center that I worked with in Poland, they do epigenetic, which is a way of looking at what is your biological age. And so the director said, okay, you doing all this kind of work, let's check your biological and your chronological age. And they did. And he said, you're going to be a centenarian. Your biological age is 21 years younger than your chronological. And that's what matters. You could be 50. If your biological age is 30, you're 30. That's it. That's how your cells are aging. And the good news is you can reverse that. And that's what I'm going to be teaching in this course.
So good. We'll put all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much. It's been just such a delight being in this conversation.
You're welcome. And thank you for your work, because you're a thought leader also. And you're right. We're right in tune with each other.
Awesome. All right, my friend.
Thank you.
Until next time. Hey there, thanks so much for listening in. If this conversation was powerful, if it stirred your soul or inspired your journey, then be sure to share it with a friend. Just copy and paste the link wherever you're listening to this podcast and text that link right now to a friend that you think would be inspired by this episode. And if this is your first time here, be sure to click that subscribe button over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a rating and review so I can get to know you and your thoughts better. To learn more about the work I do with emerging and established paradigm changers, go to thecourageousmessenger.com. That's all for today. Thanks so much for being here, and I hope to see you in the next episode.